The massive space station called Convergence floated in the darkness between stars like a city made of light and metal. And inside its countless chambers, the most powerful beings in the galaxy gathered to discuss trade and treaties and the future of 1,000 worlds. Humanity had only discovered faster-than-light travel 40 years ago, which made them bobbies in the eyes of species that had ruled the stars for 10,000 years. But they had earned their seat at the galactic conquered through determination and a stubborn refusal to be ignored. Ambassador Chen Wei stood at the viewport of the human delegation quarters and watched ships from 100 different species dock at the station, each one carrying diplomats and warriors and merchants who would smile at humanity, while secretly wondering if these newcomers were worth their attention. Behind him stood a small group of United Earth Marines in their dress uniforms, their backs straight and their eyes sharp as they scanned the room out of habit, even though they were in the safest place in the galaxy. Among them was Sergeant Elena Vasquez, a woman of 34 years with dark hair pulled back tight, and a face that showed the calm patience of someone who had seen real combat and survived it. She had fought in the Martian insurgency when the colony domes cracked and rebels tried to seize the oxygen farms, and she had held the line during the Titan crisis when everyone thought war would consume the solar system. This diplomatic mission was supposed to be easy duty, a reward for her years of service, but Elena found the endless meetings and careful words more exhausting than any battlefield. She preferred enemies who announced themselves clearly rather than ones who hid their contempt behind polite smiles. The door to the delegation quarters slid open, and a junior aide rushed in with excitement written all over his young face. Ambassador Chen turned from the viewport and raised an eyebrow at the interruption. "The Korathi delegation has arrived, sir," the aide said breathlessly. "Prince Thalvex himself is leading them, and the whole station is talking about it." Chen nodded slowly and straightened his formal jacket, while Elena watched him gather his diplomatic mask into place. The Korathi were legends in the galaxy, a warrior species that had built an empire spanning 300 star systems through conquest and strength, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. They stood 8 feet tall on average, with scales that shimmered like oil on water, and 4 muscular arms that could tear through metal when they wanted to. No species had ever beaten the Korathi in open war, and everyone in the galaxy knew it. Elena had studied them during her briefings before this mission, memorizing their history and their customs, and their fighting styles the way she memorized everything about potential threats. She knew that the Korathi respected strength above all else, and viewed younger species like humanity as amusing distractions at best. The human delegation made its way to the Great Hall where the summit would officially begin, walking through corridors filled with aliens of every shape and size. Elena kept her position at the rear of the group, her eyes never stopping their careful sweep of the surroundings, even though she knew intellectually that violence here would be political suicide for any species. Old habits kept soldiers alive, and Elena had very old habits. The Great Hall was a massive chamber with a domed ceiling that showed the stars outside, and at its center sat a circular table large enough for representatives of 50 species to gather as equals. Except they were not really equals, Elena thought as she took her position against the wall behind the human seats. Some species commanded fleets of thousands, while humanity barely had 100 ships capable of leaving the solar system. The Korathi entered last, and the room seemed to grow quieter as they did. Prince Thalvex walked at the front of his delegation, his scales painted in patterns of gold and crimson that marked his royal blood, and his 4 arms moved with the casual grace of someone who had never doubted his own power. He was young for a Korathi, barely 200 years old according to the briefings, but youth among his people meant something different than it did for humans. A young Korathi prince had still lived longer than any human in history, and had trained for combat since before humanity invented the steam engine. Thalvex surveyed the room with eyes like polished amber, and when his gaze passed over the human delegation, Alina saw his lip curl slightly in what might have been amusement or disgust. He leaned toward one of his advisors and spoke in a voice just loud enough to carry across the chamber. "I see the Conquered has started letting pets attend the summit meetings," the prince said, and several nearby delegates turned to look while pretending they had not heard. Ambassador Chen kept his expression perfectly neutral, but Alina saw his jaw tighten almost invisibly. She kept her own face blank through long practice, though something cold settled in her stomach at the casual contempt in the Korathi words. The summit began with formal greetings and ceremonial statements that seemed to go on forever, each species taking its turn to speak of cooperation and mutual benefit, while everyone present knew that politics was really about power and leverage and finding weaknesses to exploit. Alina stood motionless through all of it, her training allowing her to remain alert while appearing almost like a statue in her dress uniform. She noticed that Prince Thalvex spent much of the opening ceremony studying the various delegations, and his eyes returned to the humans more often than coincidence would explain. There was curiosity in his gaze, but also something else, something that looked like a predator sizing up prey it did not consider threatening enough to respect. When the first session ended and delegates began to mingle, Alina stayed close to Ambassador Chen as he navigated the complex social waters of interstellar diplomacy. She watched the Korathi prince move through the crowd, accepting greetings from other species with a graciousness that did not quite hide his arrogance. The other delegates treated him with careful respect that bordered on fear, and Alina understood why. The Korathi had destroyed civilizations older than humanity for insults far smaller than the ones their prince had already offered. A Trivian merchant approached Ambassador Chen to discuss trade possibilities, and Alina allowed herself a moment to observe the room more broadly. She saw junior diplomats from a dozen species casting nervous glances at the Korathi delegation. She saw old rivals exchanging polite words while their eyes promised future conflict. She saw the vast, complex machinery of galactic politics grinding forward, and somewhere in that machinery humanity was trying to find a place to stand. Prince Thalvex caught her watching and held her gaze for a long moment. Alina did not look away. Something flickered in the Korathi eyes, surprise perhaps at a human who did not immediately defer, and then his expression shifted into something that looked almost like interest. He turned away to speak with an admiral from another delegation, but Alina knew that the prince had marked her now, filed her away as something to be dealt with later. The first day of the summit ended without incident, but Alina could feel the tension building beneath the surface of diplomatic pleasantries. Ambassador Chen thanked his security detail and retired to prepare for tomorrow, and the Marines gathered in their shared quarters to compare observations. "Something is coming," Alina said quietly to her team as they reviewed the day. "The Korathi prince is looking for a reason to make a statement, and we are the newest and weakest delegation here." Corporal Davis nodded slowly, his weathered face thoughtful. "We need to be careful," he said. "One wrong word and we could give him the excuse he wants." Alina looked out the viewport at the stars that humanity had only just begun to explore, thinking about all the species out there who saw her people as insignificant newcomers. "Being careful might not be enough," she said, "but it is a start." She did not know then that the prince was already planning something that would change everything, that within days she would stand alone against a warrior who could crush her with one hand, that the entire galaxy would watch to see if humanity deserved its place among the stars. All she knew was that trouble was coming, and Alina Vasquez had never been very good at avoiding trouble. The second day of the summit brought more meetings and more careful words, and more of Prince Thalvex watching the human delegation with those amber eyes that never seemed to blink. Alina noticed that the prince had started positioning himself near, wherever the humans gathered. Not close enough to seem aggressive, but close enough to remind everyone that the Korathi were paying attention to these newcomers. Ambassador Chen pretended not to notice, which Alina knew was its own kind of message. A formal banquet was scheduled for the third evening, a grand affair meant to encourage informal diplomacy through good food and flowing drinks in a setting less rigid than the summit chambers. Alina dressed in her finest uniform and took her place along the wall with the other security personnel, while delegates from across the galaxy filled the massive dining hall. The room was beautiful in a way that made Alina slightly uncomfortable, with crystal chandeliers that floated without visible support and tables made from wood, harvested on worlds so distant that their light had not yet reached Earth. She spotted Lieutenant Park from her team, stationed near the main entrance, and Corporal Davis watching the service corridors, and she felt a little better knowing her people had eyes on all the important angles. Prince Thalvex entered with his usual entourage, and immediately became the center of attention as delegates from lesser species rushed to pay their respects. He accepted their greetings with the bored patience of someone who considered such attention his natural right, and his gaze swept the room until it found the human delegation seated at a table near the edge of the hall. Alina watched him study Ambassador Chen and the junior diplomats who sat with him, and she saw the moment when the prince decided that tonight would be the night he made his move. He approached the human table with 3 of his guards trailing behind him, each one nearly as tall and imposing as the prince himself. Ambassador Chen rose politely as custom demanded, and the junior diplomats scrambled to follow his lead with varying degrees of grace. Prince Thalvex, Ambassador Chen said with a diplomatic smile, "We are honored by your attention." The prince looked down at the humans, with an expression that mixed amusement and contempt in equal measure. "I have been curious about your species," Thalvex said in a voice that carried to nearby tables. "You have achieved faster than light travel, which is no small accomplishment, and yet you seem so fragile compared to the other space-faring races." "We have found that fragility can be deceiving, Your Highness," Chen replied smoothly. Thalvex laughed, and it was not a kind sound. "Your history suggests otherwise," he said. "Your species spent most of its existence fighting itself over patches of ground on a single world, and you nearly destroyed yourselves multiple times before you even reached your own moon." Alina saw one of the junior diplomats flinch at the words, a young woman named Sarah, who had only been with the diplomatic corps for 2 years. The prince noticed the reaction too, and his smile widened. "You there," Thalvex said, pointing at Sarah with one of his 4 hands. "Tell me what makes humanity think it deserves a place at this table when your entire civilization is younger than my morning exercise routine." Sarah opened her mouth, but no words came out, her face pale under the weight of the prince's attention and the knowledge that anything she said could become a diplomatic incident. Ambassador Chen started to intervene, but Alina was already moving. "Your Highness," Alina said, stepping forward with her hands clasped behind her back in a posture of formal respect, "the ambassador has a meeting scheduled with the Trivian delegation, and I am afraid we must excuse ourselves." The temperature in the room seemed to drop as everyone nearby realized what had just happened. A human soldier had interrupted a Korathi prince. Thalvex turned slowly to face Alina, and up close she could see just how massive he really was compared to her modest height of 5 feet 6 inches. His scales caught the light and scattered it into rainbows across his chest, and his 4 arms tensed with muscles that could probably bench press a small vehicle. "Who are you to address me?" the prince asked in a voice gone dangerously quiet. "Sergeant Alina Vasquez of the United Earth Marines," she replied, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I apologize for the interruption, Your Highness, but my duty is to the ambassador's schedule." For a long moment nobody moved. Then Thalvex made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been a growl. I see that humans train their pets to be bold, he said, but boldness without strength is merely foolishness. He turned and walked away without another word, his guards falling into step behind him, and the tension in the room slowly began to release. Ambassador Chen placed a hand on Alina's shoulder and squeezed once in silent thanks before guiding his delegation toward the doors. Sarah fell into step beside Alina as they walked. "Thank you," Sarah whispered. "I froze and I should not have, but thank you." Alina shook her head slightly. "Do not thank me yet," she said quietly. "I just made myself a target, and the prince does not seem like the type to forget a slight." The rest of the evening passed without incident, but Alina could feel eyes on her throughout the night. Not just Korathi eyes, but the curious gazes of a dozen other species who had witnessed the exchange. She had stood up to a prince of the most feared warrior race in the galaxy, and now everyone wanted to see what would happen next. The answer came 2 days later during a full session of the summit. Prince Thalvex rose from his seat and addressed the assembled delegates with the formal bearing of someone about to make an important announcement. "I invoke the Kethrava," he declared, and a ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the chamber. Alina did not know the term, but she saw Ambassador Chen go pale, and that told her everything she needed to know about how bad this was. "The Kethrava is an ancient tradition," Thalvex continued, "a challenge of honor between warriors of different species to settle disputes that words cannot resolve." He turned to look directly at Alina, where she stood against the wall. "I challenge the human soldier who dared to interrupt me," he said. "Let her face me in single combat, and let the result demonstrate whether humanity has any strength worth respecting." The chamber erupted into chaos as delegates shouted and argued, and calculated the political implications of what was happening. Alina stood frozen for a moment as the reality of the situation crashed over her. A Korathi prince who had been training for combat for 2 centuries wanted to fight her in front of the entire galaxy. Ambassador Chen was already on his feet. "This is outrageous," he protested. "Sergeant Vasquez was performing her duties, and any insult was unintentional." The officiator, a spindly creature from a neutral species, consulted a massive book of conquered law, and then spoke in a voice amplified to fill the chamber. "The Kethrava is a recognized tradition under conquered law," the officiator said. "It may be refused, but such refusal carries implications of cowardice for the challenged party species." Alina understood immediately what that meant. If she refused, then humanity would be marked as cowards, as a species too weak to stand behind their actions, and every negotiation and treaty for generations would suffer as a result. She stepped forward before Chen could refuse on her behalf. "I accept the challenge," Alina said, and her voice was steady even though her heart was pounding. The chamber fell silent. Thalvex smiled a predator smile full of teeth and confidence. "The rules are simple," he said. "Unarmed combat with no weapons or armor, and the fight ends when one party yields or falls unconscious." He paused and his smile widened. "We will fight in 3 days," he said. "I want to give you time to make peace with whatever gods your species believes in." Alina held his gaze and refused to let him see her fear. "3 days is more than enough," she said. The prince laughed and turned away, already celebrating a victory he considered inevitable. Ambassador Chen reached Alina's side, with barely controlled fury on his face. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "right now." Alina nodded and followed him out of the chamber, while the assembled delegates buzzed with speculation about what they had just witnessed. She had 3 days to prepare for a fight against an opponent who was faster and stronger and more experienced than her in every measurable way. 3 days to find a way to survive. 3 days to prove that humanity was not as weak as everyone believed. Ambassador Chen paced the length of the delegation quarters with his hands clasped behind his back and his face tight with anger and worry. Alina stood at attention near the viewport and watched him walk back and forth, while the stars outside remained perfectly still and indifferent to human problems. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" Chen finally said, stopping to face her. "You have committed humanity to a fight we cannot win against a species that has never lost a war." "With respect, Ambassador," Alina replied, keeping her voice calm. "We were already committed the moment the prince issued his challenge, and refusing would have been worse than losing." "Worse than dying?" Chen demanded. "Because that is what will happen when you step into that arena and face a Korathi warrior who has been training since before your great-great-grandmother was born." Alina had thought about that during the long walk back to the delegation quarters. She had thought about her family back on Earth, about her mother who still worried every time Alina shipped out on deployment, about her younger sister who had just gotten married last spring, about the life she might never get to live if things went badly in 3 days. But she had also thought about what it meant to be human, to be part of a species that had crawled out of caves and crossed oceans and reached for the stars despite every obstacle the universe threw at them. "Humanity did not survive by being careful," Alina said. "We survived by being stubborn and by refusing to accept that anything was impossible." Chen stared at her for a long moment, and some of the anger drained from his face to be replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "You really believe you can win?" he said. Alina shook her head. "I believe I have to try," she said. "Winning is a separate question." The ambassador sighed and ran a hand through his graying hair. "What do you need?" he asked. "Whatever resources I can provide are yours." Alina had already been making a mental list. "Access to the station database," she said, "specifically everything they have on Korathi physiology and combat techniques, and I need a space to train where nobody will watch." Chen nodded and moved to his console to begin making arrangements. Alina turned to look out the viewport at the massive station that surrounded them, thinking about the thousands of aliens who were probably already placing bets on how quickly the prince would kill her. The next 3 days blurred together into an exhausting routine of research and training, and very little sleep. Alina spent hours reading through everything the Conquered database contained about the Korathi, studying their biology and their culture, and their fighting traditions with the same intensity she had once applied to learning how to field strip a rifle blindfolded. What she learned was both terrifying and strangely encouraging. The Korathi were immensely strong, capable of generating forces that would shatter human bones with casual ease, and their scales provided natural armor that could deflect most bladed weapons. Their forearms gave them incredible reach, and the ability to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, and their reflexes were faster than anything humans could match. But they also had weaknesses. Their joints bent in predictable ways because Korathi fighting styles were ancient and formal, and every warrior trained to move the same way. Their eyes were adapted for the dim light of their home world, which meant bright flashes could temporarily blind them. Most importantly, their fighting techniques were designed for honorable duels against opponents who followed the same rules, and they had no experience facing enemies who fought dirty. Alina also discovered something interesting about Korathi endurance. They were built for explosive power, for short, intense bursts of violence that overwhelmed enemies before they could react, but their physiology was not designed for sustained effort. A Korathi could lift incredible weights, but they could not carry those weights very far. They could sprint faster than any human, but they could not maintain that speed for long. Humans, on the other hand, had evolved as persistent hunters, designed to chase prey across the African savanna for hours and days, until the prey simply collapsed from exhaustion. It was not much of an advantage, but it was something. Alina trained in a small cargo bay that Ambassador Chen had arranged for her use, running through combat drills until her muscles burned, and then running through them again. Corporal Davis and Lieutenant Park took turns sparring with her, trying to simulate the reach and strength disadvantage she would face against Thalvex, even though no human could truly replicate what the prince could do. She practiced dodging and rolling and staying in constant motion, knowing that her only chance was to never let the prince get a solid grip on her. She practiced strikes against training dummies rigged to simulate Korathi anatomy, memorizing the locations of nerve clusters and pressure points, and the sensitive gaps between scales. She practiced fighting through pain because she knew that she would get hit no matter how careful she was, and she needed to keep moving even when her body screamed at her to stop. On the second night, Corporal Davis found her still training long after everyone else had gone to sleep. "You need to rest," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "You will not beat him if you collapse from exhaustion before the fight even starts." Alina landed one more strike on the training dummy before turning to face him. "I keep thinking about what happens if I lose," she said, "not to me but to everyone else." Davis walked over and sat down on a cargo crate, his weathered face thoughtful in the dim light. "You know there is no shame in losing to a Korathi prince," he said. "Nobody expects you to win." "That is exactly the problem," Alina replied. "Everyone expects us to lose because everyone thinks humans are weak and soft and not worth taking seriously." She gestured at the viewport, where distant stars glittered like cold diamonds. "Out there are species that have been building empires for longer than humanity has had written language," she said, "and they look at us like we are children playing at being adults." Davis nodded slowly. "So you are not just fighting for yourself," he said. Alina shook her head. "I am fighting for every human who will ever come to this station," she said, "for every diplomat who will try to negotiate a treaty, and every merchant who will try to make a trade, and every explorer who will ask for permission to cross someone else's space." She looked at her hands, calloused from years of training and combat. "If I lose, then we are just another weak species to be ignored and exploited," she said. "But if I win, or even if I just refuse to go down easy, then maybe they will think twice before dismissing us." Davis was quiet for a moment. "That is a heavy burden to carry," he finally said. Alina smiled without humor. "I did not ask for it," she said, "but here we are." The night before the fight, Alina sat alone in her quarters and recorded a message for her family. She told her mother not to worry even though she knew that was impossible. She told her sister to be happy and to name her first kid after their grandmother. She told her father, who had served in the Marines before her, that she was proud to follow in his footsteps. Then she deleted the message because it felt too much like giving up. Instead, she lay in her bunk and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything she had learned in her 34 years of life. She thought about her first day of basic training, when the drill instructor had screamed at her for 2 hours straight, and she had refused to cry. She thought about the Martian insurgency, when she had held a defensive position for 18 hours with no sleep and no backup, and had somehow survived. She thought about all the times she had been told she was too small or too weak or too stubborn, and how she had proven every single one of those voices wrong. Tomorrow she would face an opponent who was stronger and faster and more experienced than her. Tomorrow she might die. But tomorrow she would also show the entire galaxy what a human being was capable of when backed into a corner with nowhere to run. Alina closed her eyes and let herself drift into a dreamless sleep, saving her strength for the battle to come. When she woke, the stars outside her viewport had not moved, but everything else had changed. Today was the day. Today she would fight a prince of the Korathi Empire in front of thousands of witnesses. Today she would prove that humanity deserved its place among the stars. Or today she would die trying. Alina got dressed and checked her reflection in the mirror, seeing a woman who looked calm even though her heart was racing. She had done everything she could to prepare. Now she just had to survive. The arena was a circular platform made of some material that looked like polished stone, but felt slightly soft beneath Alina's feet as she walked across it to take her position. Around the platform rose tier after tier of seating, filled with delegates and dignitaries from every corner of the galaxy. Thousands of eyes watching her with curiosity or pity, or eager anticipation of the violence to come. The chamber was designed to amplify sound, and Alina could hear every whisper and murmur and speculation about how quickly the human would fall. She blocked it all out and focused on her breathing the way she had been taught years ago in basic training. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow and steady and controlled. Her body was loose and ready, her muscles warm from the stretching she had done in the preparation room. She wore simple training clothes that allowed full range of motion, nothing that an opponent could grab or use against her. Prince Thalvex entered from the opposite side of the arena, and the crowd erupted into cheers that made the floor vibrate beneath Alina's feet. He was painted in the ceremonial colors of his house, gold and crimson swirling across his scales in patterns that told the story of his ancestors' victories. His forearms were raised in triumph, and his smile was the smile of someone who had already won and was simply waiting for the formality of actually fighting. The prince crossed the arena with long, confident strides and stopped a few meters from Alina, looking down at her with those amber eyes that had never learned what it meant to fear. "You surprised me by accepting the challenge," Thalvex said in a voice loud enough for the nearby seats to hear. "I expected your ambassador to make excuses on your behalf." Alina met his gaze without flinching. "My people do not make excuses," she replied. The prince laughed, and it was the laugh of someone genuinely amused by a clever pet. "We will see," he said. The officiator stepped forward, the same spindly neutral creature who had confirmed the legality of the challenge 3 days ago. "The rules are as follows," the officiator announced in an amplified voice that filled the entire chamber. "This is unarmed combat with no weapons or armor permitted, and the fight ends when one combatant yields or is rendered unconscious." The officiator looked at Alina and then at Thalvex. "Do both parties understand and accept these terms?" the officiator asked. Alina nodded once. "I understand and accept," she said. Thalvex waved a hand dismissively. "Obviously," he said. The officiator retreated to a safe distance and raised one appendage high above its head. "The fight will begin when I lower my hand," the officiator said. "May honor guide your actions." For a moment, everything was still. Alina could hear her own heartbeat loud in her ears. She could see the prince's muscles tense in anticipation. She could feel the weight of thousands of eyes pressing down on her. The hand dropped. Thalvex charged immediately, crossing the distance between them in 2 massive strides with all 4 arms extended to grab and crush. It was exactly what Alina had expected from her research. Korathi warriors believed in overwhelming force, applied quickly and decisively. She waited until the last possible moment, until his hands were almost close enough to touch her, and then she moved. Not backward where he expected her to go, but sideways, slipping past his reaching arms like water flowing around a stone. As she moved, she drove her fist into the nerve cluster behind his right knee, hitting the spot her research had identified as vulnerable with every ounce of strength she possessed. The prince stumbled. It was a small thing, barely visible to the watching crowd, but Alina saw his amber eyes widen with surprise. He had expected her to run or to freeze, or to fight back in a way he could easily counter. He had not expected her to know exactly where to hit him. Thalvex wheeled around with new caution in his movements, his 4 arms raised in a defensive posture that covered most of the angles of attack. "Interesting," he said. "You have done your research." Alina did not waste breath on a response. She kept moving, circling him slowly, watching for openings. The prince attacked again, faster this time, all four arms working in coordinated sweeps designed to catch her no matter which direction she dodged. Alina ducked under the first pair of arms and twisted away from the second, feeling the wind of his strike pass close enough to ruffle her hair. She landed two more strikes as she moved, one to the sensitive area under his upper left arm and one to the gap between scales on his side. Neither blow did serious damage, but both made him flinch. The fight continued like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Thalvex attacked, and Alina dodged and counterattacked, never staying still long enough for him to grab her, always moving and striking and moving again. The crowd grew quieter as the fight went on, their confident predictions of a quick Korathi victory fading as the human refused to fall. But Alina was taking damage too. The prince was too fast and too skilled for her to avoid everything. A glancing blow caught her across the shoulder and sent her spinning. Another strike grazed her ribs hard enough to make breathing painful. A backhand from his lower left arm opened a cut on her scalp that sent blood streaming down her face. She kept moving. She kept fighting. Thalvex was starting to breathe harder now, his explosive Korathi physiology burning through its reserves of energy, while Alina's persistence, hunter endurance kept her going. He had probably never fought an opponent who lasted this long. He had certainly never fought one who kept coming back, no matter how many times he hit her. "You are more resilient than I expected," the prince admitted between attacks, but resilience is not the same as victory. Alina spat blood onto the arena floor. "Then stop talking and finish it," she said. The prince roared and launched his most ferocious assault yet, all four arms blurring with speed as he tried to overwhelm her through sheer volume of attacks. Alina could not dodge everything. A blow caught her left leg, and she felt something give way with a spike of pain that nearly made her scream. She stumbled, and for a moment she thought it was over. But stumbling put her lower than the prince expected, and suddenly she was inside his guard, too close for his longer arms to reach effectively. She did not hesitate. Every technique she had practiced, every weak point she had memorized, every dirty trick she knew from years of combat experience all came together in a single desperate sequence. She drove her fingers into the pressure point under his primary right arm. She slammed her elbow into the nerve cluster on his inner thigh. She grabbed one of his lower arms and twisted it at an angle that Korathi joints were not designed to handle. Thalvex bellowed in pain and surprise and tried to pull away, but Alina stayed with him, moving when he moved, keeping herself inside his reach where his strength advantage meant less. The prince threw himself backward to create distance, and Alina let him go, using the moment to catch her breath and assess her own condition. Her left leg was badly hurt, probably a torn ligament, and every breath sent pain shooting through her ribs. The cut on her scalp was still bleeding, and she could taste copper in her mouth. But she was still standing. And for the first time since the fight began, Prince Thalvex looked uncertain. The crowd was completely silent now, thousands of beings watching in disbelief as a human half the size of a Korathi prince refused to fall. Alina looked at her opponent and saw what her research had predicted. He was tired. His explosive power was fading. His breathing was ragged, and his movements were slower than they had been at the start. Persistence hunting, Alina thought. We used to chase animals until they collapsed. She started moving again, circling, waiting, and for the first time she saw something that looked like fear flicker in the prince's amber eyes. This was not over yet. But for the first time, Alina believed she might actually survive. 11 minutes had passed since the officiator dropped their hand and started the fight. Alina knew this because she had been counting in her head the way she always did during combat, tracking time and distance and angles without conscious thought. 11 minutes of constant movement and pain and survival. The longest 11 minutes of her life. Prince Thalvex was visibly struggling now, his scales dull with exhaustion and his 4 arms moving slower than they had at the start. He had never faced an opponent like this, someone who refused to stay down and kept coming back no matter how many times she got hit. His entire fighting style was built around overwhelming enemies quickly, and the human woman bleeding in front of him simply would not be overwhelmed. Alina pressed her advantage. She attacked more aggressively now, darting in to land strikes on nerve clusters and sensitive spots before dancing away from his weakening counterattacks. Each blow did small damage, but the damage was adding up. She could see him favoring his right side, where she had twisted his arm earlier. She could see his lower left arm, hanging slightly limp from the pressure point attack. He was hurt and tired and confused, and Alina was still moving. The prince roared in frustration and charged again, with the last reserves of his fatting strength. It was a desperate attack, all power and no precision, and Alina saw her opening. Instead of dodging to the side, she dropped low and rolled forward, passing directly under his grasping arms and coming up behind him. Before he could turn, she jumped onto his back and wrapped her arm around his throat. It was a chokehold that worked on almost any species with a centralized brain, cutting off blood flow to the head and causing unconsciousness within seconds if applied correctly. Alina had practiced this technique thousands of times over her years as a Marine. She knew exactly how much pressure to apply. Thalvex thrashed wildly, his 4 arms reaching back to grab her, but she was positioned where his joints could not easily reach, and every time he almost got a grip, she adjusted her position to stay out of range. His movements grew weaker as the blood flow to his brain diminished. The crowd was screaming now, some cheering and some protesting and some simply making noise because they could not believe what they were seeing. A human was about to defeat a prince of the Korathi Empire. Thalvex fell to his knees. His arms stopped reaching for her. His body swayed. "I yield," the prince gasped, the words barely audible through his constricted throat. "I yield." Alina held the chokehold for one more second to make sure he was not faking, then released him and stepped back. The prince collapsed forward onto his hands and knees, gasping for air with great heaving breaths that shook his entire body. The officiator rushed forward and raised their appendage toward Alina. "The challenge is concluded," the officiator announced. "The human is victorious." For a long moment the arena was completely silent. Then the applause began. Not from the Korathi delegation who sat in stunned silence, but from dozens of other species who had watched a warrior half the size of her opponent refuse to give up until she won. The applause grew louder and louder until it echoed through the chamber like thunder. Alina stood in the center of the arena, bleeding and broken and barely able to stay upright, and she had never felt more alive. Ambassador Chen rushed to her side with a medical team close behind. "You did it," Chen said with something like awe in his voice. "You actually did it." Alina let the medical team catch her as her legs finally gave out. "I need a vacation," she said. The days after the fight blurred together in a haze of medical treatment and diplomatic meetings, and interview requests from species Alina had never even heard of. Prince Thalvex was disgraced by his defeat, his humiliation broadcast across the entire Concord. By Korathi tradition, a warrior who lost to a lesser opponent was unfit for rule, and the prince would spend the next decade in exile trying to reclaim his honor. The Korathi emperor sent a formal protest to the Concord, but there was nothing he could do. The fight had been conducted according to ancient laws that the Korathi themselves had championed for millennia. More importantly, the other species of the Conquered had begun to see humanity differently. These small, soft, short-lived creatures were not merely survivors. They were something else entirely. They were persistent hunters who refused to accept defeat. They were adapters who found weaknesses others missed. They were fighters who would not stop no matter how badly they were hurt. Trade offers and alliance proposals flooded the human delegation in numbers that would have seemed impossible a week ago. Species that had ignored humanity for decades suddenly wanted to talk about treaties and partnerships and mutual defense agreements. Ambassador Chen barely slept for weeks trying to handle all the new opportunities. Alina was offered promotions and medals and speaking engagements at military academies across human space. She accepted the medals because refusing would have been rude, but she turned down the promotions because she liked being a Marine and did not want to spend her life behind a desk. She did accept one speaking engagement at her old training facility on Earth, where she told a group of new recruits that the secret to beating a stronger opponent was simply refusing to believe that strength was everything. 6 months after the fight, Alina finally took that vacation. She went home to Buenos Aires to visit her family, and she spent a week doing nothing more strenuous than eating her mother cooking and playing with her sister's new baby. On her last night home, her niece, who was 5 years old, asked Alina what the aliens were like. Alina thought about the question for a long moment. She thought about Prince Thalvex towering over her in that arena, about the moment when she accepted the challenge knowing she might die, about the 11 minutes of pain and fear and determination that had changed everything. Big, Alina finally said. Very big, but not as tough as they think. Her niece nodded seriously, as if this was very important information. Later that night, Alina sat alone on the roof of her family home and watched the stars. Somewhere out there were 300 Korathi systems, filled with warriors who now knew that humans were not easy prey. Somewhere out there were thousands of other species, reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the newcomers from Earth. Alina touched the scar on her scalp, where the prince had cut her during the fight. It had healed cleanly, but she could still feel the raised line of tissue under her fingertips. Some nights she still woke up in a cold sweat, dreaming of 4 arms closing around her, and the certainty that she was about to die. She suspected she would have those dreams for the rest of her life. But that was okay. Some prices were worth paying. Alina Vasquez looked up at the stars that humanity had only begun to explore, and she smiled. The galaxy was vast and ancient and full of species that had been building empires for longer than humans had existed. But now those species knew something they had not known before. They knew that humans were stubborn and resourceful, and absolutely refused to accept that anything was impossible. They knew that humans would keep getting up no matter how many times they were knocked down. They knew that underestimating humanity was a mistake that could cost them everything. One day Alina would return to the stars and face new challenges and new enemies. One day humanity would take its place among the great powers of the galaxy, not because anyone gave them permission, but because they refused to be denied. But for now she was content to sit on her family roof and watch the lights in the sky and remember the day she taught an alien prince that size was not everything. The stars glittered cold and distant above her, and somewhere among them the Korathi were learning to be afraid. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was the beginning of everything.